Okay, today we're going to talk about Chapter 10 in your textbook, which covers socio-emotional development in adolescence. And one of the major themes of this chapter is identity, which is an important topic for development in adolescence. And adolescence is largely considered absolutely crucial to identity development. And our identity is our self-portrait. And there are different aspects to our self-portrait. There are many pieces. Okay, so Erikson was one of the earlier researchers in the topic of identity. And because of his psychoanalytic background, he very much believed that the process of developing identity had the context of transition or crisis. So he called it crisis. We might call it transition now. And his fifth stage for adolescence was identity versus identity confusion. Confusion. And he felt that it was the task of adolescence to figure out who you are and to have that sorted out before you could move easily or comfortably on to the next stage of development in adulthood. So now this identity confusion is possibly a result of a number of different factors, including that personal commitment doesn't happen. If you don't commit to the identity, then identity confusion is going to result. Now, Marcia did some research starting with Erikson's identity moratorium, which is what Erikson felt would happen if you didn't moratorium. There we go. If you didn't resolve your identity crisis in adolescence. So for Marcia, there's 4 statuses of identity instead of just whether you have your identity or not. From Erikson's theory, he did a lot more research on this, and what he found was 4 statuses. Identity diffusion is when you really don't know who you are or what you want, right? You haven't committed and you haven't experienced a crisis yet. And so he did believe in Erikson's theory that you needed to experience a crisis in order to develop an identity, and that if you didn't, then diffusion was one of the likely outcomes. And this tends to happen in people who don't really have the interest in exploring their identity yet. Identity foreclosure happens more often than not when someone else has decided for the adolescent what their identity is going to be. So it's pretty commonly handed down by parents in authoritarian style parenting situations. And they have been required to make a commitment from the parents, but they really haven't experienced the crisis that drove them to do the seeking. There was no really seeking. There was no option exploration on their part. Now, moratorium, right, is another word, moratorium, for Erikson's identity confusion. And this is where you're in the midst of a crisis, but there's no commitment, and there's really no definition of what you're looking for. It's very vague. So you're kind of stuck. Moratorium means like almost in limbo, delayed, right? Then there's identity achievement, which we now know is much more likely to happen in early adulthood or emerging adulthood, which comes in the early to middle 20s, because especially as our population is aging and more of the world becomes westernized, there's not as much a rush to grow up, and there's not as much a rush to get to this stage. So more recent research is definitely finding that achievement is much more common in early emerging adulthood, and that diffusion and moratorium really diffusion and foreclosure are younger adolescents, and moratorium is usually kind of the in-between stage, maybe college age. Okay. All right, so there is now a lot more focus on the fact that identity is not only a task of adolescence, that it is actually a lifelong process, and certainly the search for who you are and what you want can change, and so your sense of who you are can also change. And so I get a lot of students as adult learners who have had a couple of kids, raised a few kids, and now want to do something else with their lives. And they are definitely trying to find a new place, a new identity. And this is common in these transitions that many researchers have identified, that in these vulnerable places is also where the opportunity to explore your identity and maybe even go back through your cycles again of maybe being in a moratorium, maybe doing a little exploration. And so now that we have an average of 5 careers in a lifetime, this makes sense that we might reinvent ourselves several times over our life. Okay. All right, so one of the aspects of identity, remember we saw that list of different kinds of identity. One of them was cultural or ethnic identities. And in ethnic identity, that's that sense of who you are in relation to the culture that you belong to, the membership, the group you have membership in. And these attitudes and feelings that are related to that membership help you identify who you are in relation to the other members of the group. This ethnic identity, a single ethnic identity, is much more common for first generation immigrants. Bicultural identity is when you actually identify with 2 cultures, bi means 2, and bicultural ethnic identity. And these are often adolescents who maybe have one culture and language at home, but the majority culture that they go to school in actually encourages them to explore another identity separately from their culture of origin. All right, so in specific immigrant situations, you see different processes and more likelihood of people sticking with their original ethnic identities versus moving to bicultural. As I briefly mentioned, the first generation is generally, sticks with their original ethnic identity and may never explore another cultural identity. That isn't to say they might not explore other occupational or other identities, but they tend to stick with the same ethnic identity. Second generation immigrants are much more likely to see themselves as either bicultural or the culture the dominant culture that they live in. They might even see themselves as Americans, if we're talking about largely in the context of Western and American civilization here, culture. And it's very common that if they retain any of their earlier ethnic identity, that it's tied to their language and their social networks. And they might do that more if they stick with a bicultural identity instead of a strictly American identity. Okay. So that search for identity, that process of understanding the story of who you are, is tied to a couple of issues. And one of them is autonomy, and the other is attachment. And what we understand from a lot of the recent research that's been done is that the search for autonomy or independence is very much tied to the search for who you are, for your identity. And it often confuses parents, but it's part of the process of learning who you are and learning how you relate in the larger world, and this is often where the risk-taking behaviors will happen. But the attachment to the parent is now become understood is very critical to reducing the likelihood that these risk-taking behaviors are of the reckless kind, shall I say, instead of the calculated risk-taking kind. And so kids with more secure attachments with parents who actually relinquish control to a certain extent to let the student feel that they can be more in charge of reasonable decisions in their life and go search for their independence. These are the adolescents who do better, that tend to have less reckless risk-taking. There are some gender differences too. Boys tend to be given in our Western culture more independence, more autonomy at an earlier age than girls do. And but for both genders, That attachment is really, really, really important. And it's, even though they focus a lot in past research on peers, the attachment with the parents now we understand is actually very important.